All right, we're going to be covering James C. Scott, Against the Grain, A Deep History in the Earliest States. One thing that I've felt could have been a little stronger in this particular writing was the definition of a state. A state is a bordered community, agricultural based, with a system of taxation that is sedentary. That's the extracted meaning that is gotten out of Against the Grain. The book is called Against the Grain because it is Scott's contention that these first estates were based around grains. He said it was based around grains because grains could be easily taxed. You could keep it a long time, you could store it, you could measure it, you could separate it. So that's why grains was the main thing that was dealing around the center of taxation. It's a very Marxist concept in this book. You know, it's about the community is based around taxation. It's based around money, so to speak. The money is just grain in this particular case. Now, understanding the definition of the state, we're talking about the moving from hunter-gatherers to sedentary communities. These sedentary communities formed around rivers. Now, it is Scott's position that the earliest states were around the Tigris and Euphrates. And there's also history that shows that Kemet, or what's known as Egypt, was well formed long before any of the Indus Valley areas, and these people migrated up from the African continent. Not trying to get into Egyptology or Kemetan study, but this is his particular position that this is where these particular communities started, these states. And they were started by people because these areas around rivers, Tigris and Euphrates in this particular instance, because the river did most of the work that you would need for an agricultural community. It cleared the land, it plowed the land, it fertilized the land, it caused everything to grow really quickly. Also, because it naturally grew things, because of the river, animals descended on the area to eat berries, not babies, berries, grass, leaves, and whatever else that they ate. So it was easy picking. It was fruit to eat. It was things to cultivate, and even nomadic people. The hunter-gatherers were nomadic people. They moved around. They still grew things before, until they moved. So growing things wasn't necessarily a new dynamic, but it was so easy to do that in these particular areas. Food is coming to you, the meat is coming to you, that these people automatically began to stay in these general areas, and tribal systems had already been in place with shaman and chiefs and things like that, where these communities had begun to form, and it was not clear as to when the leadership or hierarchy structure came into place about who's going to be a soldier, who's going to be a faith leader, who are going to have jobs that serve the community, that took them out of the responsibility of agriculture. And everyone who did not have one of those jobs, the hunters that brought food back or the soldiers that defended it, those people still need to eat. So everyone else grew enough food, and a portion of their food had to go to the community to feed those people because their jobs took them out where they couldn't do that. So obviously, over time, that became a very abused concept of taxation, whereas people did not necessarily enjoy that. So a lot of them wanted to leave. It is Scott's contention that if too many people left, the community would fall. So there was a restriction and control over the people in that area, as to where the walls or borders that were thought to stop people from coming in, as historically taught, was also to keep people from getting out, because you needed so many people to sustain your state. Now that's questionable, but where we're talking about domestication, domestication of animals, domestication of people, because now they're forced to stay there. So now they're being domesticated, because under domestication, the definition of domestication as Scott is using it is to take something from its natural state, integrate it into the fabric of a community, where and control it to the extent that it cannot return to its natural state, or it's difficult for it to. So in this case, people are domesticated, because once you become part of the state, it's hard for you to go back to being a nomad, because the walls are there to keep you in as well as to protect you. I give an example of one of the first things that people domesticated was fire. And there was a debate about the extent to which fire is actually domesticated. And we can go into expertise and knowledge, but fire to an extent can be controlled. It can be controlled how hot it gets. It can be controlled how far it spreads. It can be controlled when it goes out. So the same could be with animals, as to where you can have an animal ingrained into a system as to where it can no longer return back to the wild. So he was showing which gets us into the ecology, how everything relates to everything else. And in this particular system, there is everything is connected. The tax is connected to the grain is connected to the land is connected to the location is connected to the river is what's drawing the animals, and then even disease becomes domesticated, because you have people bringing animals, because there was little contact between animals and people in comparison to a sedentary community, because now you're there with the animal, as opposed to you may have an animal here for a minute and then eat that one or whatever, but now you're actually growing animals, and a multitude of animals. So you have all of these different types of bacteria, and when you have crops, you're going to attract mice, you're going to attract insects, you're going to attract into a confined area. So a new ecological dynamic is going to occur with the development of a state. It's very interesting. It was one of those readings that it was better to read with a group. I think it was a higher level reading than one would anticipate reading on their own until it's discussed with a group. There was a dynamic that was covered in here as to where one would think the agricultural setting had a better effect on nutrition than the nomadic people. But actually, the variety of diet of the nomadic people was better than the sedentary people. Whereas the sedentary people were smaller and weaker than the hunter-gatherers. So again, in staying with our time, this is James C. Scott, Against the Grain, A Deep History in the Earliest States.